make a visible folder on our way, so we get them ready. And then I need to get started. The tech is still working itself out, but I wanted to talk about some that have been floating around, and just a quick review of what we have done. Our first session together, we attempted through a variety of methods to kind of describe what Christian nationalism is. And so there were 2 handouts on that day, and I'm happy to make them for others. I think, Terry, you need one from that day, and Claudia, and I will go and make that copy for you during this time. And then last week, Joe Vanderkloot presented on some strategies for how we listen and how we understand. Our opponents are stupid, that they don't appreciate what's best for themselves in the country. And in contrast, we think we and others who agree with us are smart and always doing and voting in ways that are best for ourselves and our country. So that's what this is. So I'm going to hand out this. These are the talking points from last week's Hidden Brain. So if you could just pass those around. And then today, Florian Hill is going to, and he has a handout, right?
Yeah, I hope it went around it. Yes.
The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And he is going to talk about the rise and fall of the Third Reich in Germany and worldwide. And the next week, we're going to talk about what our response might be, with some teaching at the beginning with Valerie Kohr's work. So that's kind of the outline. And are we ready technically?
I think so. Is Florian also speaking?
Oh, it's just Florian. Yeah.
Oh, it's just him. So I got this. Are you not talking at all?
I'm going to be a model participant.
Good answer. Good answer.
I want to make sure that you can hear there. Lori, can you come on Zoom?
I think that's you that needs to unmute, right? The laptop host.
No, we got it. Everything's good. I just wanted to make sure I could hear that we could all hear the Zoom people.
Oh, okay. Yep. I can hear you and you can hear me, I take it.
I think you're good.
And the What is Christian Nationalism, what I was going to copy, just disappeared. Does anyone know what happened to that?
I got one. I'm sitting on something.
Oh, yeah. That's it. This is yours. So I'm going to make a copy and give it to Terry and Claudia. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you. This is sort of an interesting topic to me. And I'll just give maybe just a little bit of background. I mean, you all know this probably better than I do, just sort of the historical, cultural background to the 1930s. And then, as you probably know, of course, the Nazis clearly weren't Christians, right? So it's not a Christian nationalist movement that the Nazis had. The interesting thing to me for today is to maybe ask some questions about why did so many Christians go along with this movement. And then we have at least one case study of somebody who didn't, which then is hopefully something for us to sort of look at and see how can you sort of inoculate yourself against these kinds of movements that try to, of course, co-opt as many people as possible. So just to set the table to the 1930s in Germany, you have of course, the end of the World War. You have, the emperor stepping down, right? So I have grandparents who were born under an emperor, right? Which sounds so medieval. But it's, of course, an incredible break, right, in the history, right? There were a lot of people who were monarchists and who were entirely committed to that. You had the loss in the World War, which was, of course, a shock as well. Then hit the Versailles Treaty. All of these things in 1918-19 caused such a disruption, such a break in Germany. Then you have this, incredible inflation in the early 1920s, where people would get paid in the morning, and if they hadn't spent everything by the afternoon, it was worthless, right? So you had to pay billions of dollars for a loaf of bread. Of course, if you had saved up, 100,000, marks, for your retirement, you could buy a cookie for it if you were lucky, right? So the disruptions that people experienced financially and politically were enormous, and then of course also spiritually. So the World War I was a real death of God experience, and then you put a democratic government in charge that has to sign the Versailles Treaty and doesn't have the backing of most of the population. So the democratic institutions in Germany don't really take hold in 1919 in the Weimar Republic. And so it's not a country that has a tradition of committed, Democrats with a lowercase d. The world economic crisis in 1929, of course, hits Germany, and there's a lot of unemployment. And so it's just not a settled and stable country in the late 20s, early 30s. Now, recently, I was reading the Oppenheimer biography, and he's in Göttingen in 1928. And he writes home and he says, everybody's angry, right? So he's in a country where people are angry, they feel like they've been humiliated, and they want to be great again, right? They don't want to be the humiliated losers, and they want to go back to something that they know. And so there's just it's a time of an enormous cultural crisis, a spiritual crisis, a political crisis. And then into that, come the Nazis, who are entirely without success all the way through the 20s into the early 30s. And not until elections in 1932 do they actually sort of gain some popularity. Never get more than a third of the vote, but it's still, the highest vote-getting party. So that's how they get into power in 1933. A man who was there is William Shirer, and he wrote this great book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. So he's a journalist, he's a historian, and he's also a contemporary witness to it. He's in Berlin in the 1930s. He lives through the whole thing. And then after 1945, he gets access to the trove of documents, right? Because the Germans document everything that they do. And so he writes this book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which is really it's a fascinating book. Of course, more modern books have been written since, but then those are historians that didn't live through it. So his is really a fascinating book. So the first thing I want to look at is something here in your handout. On the first page, you turn the page in the handout. It's the persecution of the Christian churches, right? So the Nazis are very much anti-religion. Right? They don't want any other power source in the country. And obviously, if you have allegiance to religion, right, then you might not do what the Führer tells you to do. And so they really want to eliminate religion as much as they can. But of course, early on, they also take just, lying down and collaborating as an option. And that's essentially what the Catholic Church does. Right? They signed a concordat between the Nazi government and the Vatican. And so in a way, the Catholic Church is dealt with slightly more easily because it's extremely centralized. The Protestant churches are a little less centralized. There really is only the Lutheran Church, but it has regional churches that have a certain amount of autonomy. Nothing like what we have today at all. It's still much more centralized and uniform than anything that we have. But what they're trying to do then is to get the Protestants also unified, right? Because the more unified you can get the church, the easier it is to control it. So the Nazis would like to have a Protestant, Führer, so to speak, whom the Nazis can then control. And then within the Protestant churches, then there are a lot who go along. There's some who don't, and then there are a lot who doesn't really care. And so I want to look at the paragraph beginning with the Protestants in Germany. There's on 235, right? It's the bottom paragraph. Um, and since I'm not getting paid enough to do all the talking here, I'm going to ask somebody to read that paragraph, and then we can see what we think of that. Maybe somebody who sits reasonably close to this mic.
So it's on the bottom of page 235.
Starting with the Protestants in Germany.
Okay. Well, if you'd like me to read it, I will. But I'm kind of. All right, well, here we go. The Protestants in Germany, as in the United States, were a divided faith. Only a very few, some 150,000 out of 45 million of them, belonged to the various free churches, such as the Baptists and the Methodists. The rest belonged to 28 Lutheran and Reformed churches, of which the largest was the Church of the Old Prussian Union, with 18 million members. With the rise of the National Socialism, there came further divisions among the Protestants. The more fanatical Nazis among them organized in 1932 the German Christians faith movement, of which the most vehement leader was a certain Ludwig Müller. I said that sort of right.
Very good.
Army chaplain of the East Prussian military district, a devoted follower of Hitler, who at first brought the Führer together, say that one for him.
General von Blumberg.
That, together with General von Blumberg, when the latter commanded the district. The German Christians ardently supported the Nazis' doctrines of race and leadership principle and wanted them applied to a Reich church, which would bring all Protestants into one all-embracing body. In 1933, the German Christians had some 3,000 out of a total of 17,000 pastors, though their lay followers probably represented a larger percentage of churchgoers.
Can we read two more? You don't have to do all of this, Betsy. Somebody read the next one. Yeah, Holly.
Opposed to the German Christians was another minority group, which called itself the Confessional Church. It had about the same number of pastors and was eventually led by Niemöller.
Yep.
It opposed the Nazification of the Protestant churches, rejected the Nazi racial theories, and denounced the anti-Christian doctrines of Rosenberg and the other Nazi leaders. In between lay the majority of Protestants who seemed too timid to join either of the two warring groups, who sat on the fence and eventually, for the most part, landed in the arms of Hitler, accepting his authority to intervene in church affairs and obeying his commands without open protest.
Yeah. So that's kind of what always happens, right? You've got people who are pretty vocal here, you got people who are pretty vocal here, and then you've got a lot of people who are just sort of waiting to see which way the wind is ultimately going to blow. And then comes a really interesting paragraph. If somebody can read the next paragraph, gives us some background.
It is difficult to understand the behavior of most German Protestants in the first Nazi years, unless one is aware of two things: their history and the influence of Martin Luther. The great founder of Protestantism was both a passionate anti-Semite and a ferocious believer in absolute obedience to political authority. He wanted, I assume we're talking about Martin Luther?
Yep.
He wanted Germany rid of the Jews, and when they were sent away, he advised that they be deprived of all their cash and jewels and silver and gold. And furthermore, that their synagogues or schools be set on fire, that their houses be broken up and destroyed, and they be put under a roof or stable like the gypsies, in misery and captivity as they incessantly lament and complain to God about us. Advice that was literally followed 4 centuries later by Hitler, Goering, and Himmler.
So that's interesting, isn't it?
I didn't know that.
I didn't.
Right. So what you have then in Germany is a Protestant church that has been sort of raised on this Lutheran anti-Semitism and also this very extreme obedience to authority. And obedience to authority is a very German thing anyway. And so the churches were like that as well, right? The worldly leaders are appointed by God, and therefore you have to follow those. And then you've got your church over here, and then the worldly authority over there.
So even the elected leaders were seen to be as appointed by God, not just the monarch always claimed right to rule
Yes.
by divine authority, but also now the elected leaders.
Yes. Exactly. And so he writes in the next paragraph is that, like, outside of the Tsar in Russia, there's really no other country where you have such an extreme obedience to worldly leaders as you have in Germany. Unfortunately, not so much to the elected leaders of the Weimar Republic. So, again, these things don't always make sense all the way across the board, but a lot of people were dissatisfied with the democratic leaders. So it was sort of more these older appointed leaders that they were so obedient to. So one wishes they would have been more obedient to the democratically elected leaders in the Weimar Republic, but they weren't so much. So Niemöller, whom you might have heard of, and who's mentioned here as the leader of the Confessional Church, which is the Christian Nationalist movement, he was entirely pro-Nazi and even voted for them. He made a pretty quick turnaround. He realized quickly he made a mistake. But most Protestant pastors, most Protestants in Germany were looking forward to a rejuvenated, strengthened Germany, and they saw in the Nazis a fulfillment of their wishes. Yeah.
What was the Nazi platform, if you will?
Mhm.
I mean,
About
what was
religion?
their belief about anything?
In terms of religion, they wanted no religion. I mean,
So what did they want?
It was race, wasn't it, the main thing?
well, they wanted total obedience to the Führer, right? They actually have this written down. I don't even know if we have this copied here. It's insane on page 240. If you skip to the bottom of page 240, this is sort of the what they wanted to have, something called a National Reich Church, and these are really sort of absolutely anti-religious, of course. Look at number 13, right? Immediate cessation of the publishing and dissemination of the Bible in Germany. Mein Kampf is the greatest of all documents. Look at number 18. All crucifixes, Bibles, and pictures of saints will be removed. On the altars, therefore, must be nothing but Mein Kampf, and to the left of the altar, a sword. And then at the bottom, on the day of its foundation, the Christian cross must be removed from all churches, cathedrals, and chapels, and it must be superseded by the only unconquerable symbol, the swastika. So if you want the religious program of the Nazis, it was to remove religion altogether and to have total Führer.
And that was their primary. Just
Yeah, I mean, so the primary goal was to have power, right? And if the Protestants and Catholics go along with it, at first that's of course fine, right? As long as there's no opposition to us. But ultimately, the churches needed to be destroyed because they obviously present a potential counter authority.
The swastika is a symbol of the cross.
Well, not for the Nazis.
Symbol of the cross.
Well, but for the Nazis, it had nothing to do with Christ.
I mean, but he knew about the Aryans, and that's what he's in favor of Aryans.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I mean, this is a purely master race kind of program. There's no room for anything else in that.
Is there any information about how many people left and went somewhere else? Like my family, I have German heritage, and my great grandparents and their whole family, there were actually 3 families. We had one Schlegel, von Pattmeyer, and a few others in there.
Yeah.
And they were landed. They had land, and were pretty high up, in terms of where they were in the society. But they left.
Good on them. Yeah, I mean, so of course, a lot of people left. And often those were the people who had more to lose, maybe, right? Landed people, also people who were more far-seeing, right? It's the Einsteins and the Thomas Manns and Bertolt Brechts, right, who leave, who can see this coming. And of course, then there were millions and millions, and a vast majority of Germans who couldn't leave because they didn't have the funds. They lived in their little, apartment and had their jobs there. So no, there were many left. The universities were cleared of a lot of unwanted professors, and those could find appointments in other countries. So a lot of people had the means left, but yeah. So yeah, and so somebody like Niemöller would have had the opportunity to leave, but he actually welcomed it. And so a lot of Protestants, and I think this is the key sort of insight for me when I studied this, were just fine. I think it was a small minority of people who left. It was a small minority of people who vocally opposed, what was happening.
I was just thinking it might be worthwhile to talk about what happened to those people who vocally opposed, like the 800 confessing church pastors.
Yeah, so by 1937, the Nazis were well enough ensconced, and they also had, written out the Olympics where they had to present, sort of a more, smiling face to the world. But they were so secure then after that by 1937, they actually arrested a lot of pastors of the confessing church. And you probably heard this famous statement by Martin Niemöller, the leader of the confessing church, who said, when they came for the Jews, I didn't speak up. When they came for the labor movement, I didn't speak up. When they came for the Catholics, I didn't speak up. When they came for me, there was nobody left to speak up for me. And so so they were actually arresting hundreds and hundreds of pastors who were opposed. And that started by 1937. A few of them were arrested earlier, but like the mass sort of pressure didn't start immediately, because immediately the churches actually weren't a major concern because there wasn't so much opposition coming from them. Right? I mean, there wasn't that much opposition anyway, but it certainly didn't come from the churches where you probably should expect it. But that really didn't happen so much. Right? There were some Catholics who were outspoken against the eugenics programs and euthanasia programs. But yeah, ultimately, the church didn't present a major problem. Yeah.
You're outspoken against which programs?
The eugenics programs and sort of the sterilization programs and the murder of disabled people, which all happened, fairly soon. But again, there wasn't that much opposition to it. A lot of Germans wanted sort of a cleansing and a rebirth, right, and a re-strengthening of the country, and so they thought those were worthwhile sacrifices to make.
What lay behind that feeling in the German populace? How did that arise?
So I think there were obviously a million different reasons, but I think some of the main reasons that people talk about were that the humiliation of 1918 was really deep in a lot of Germans. They felt like, they were not respected, they weren't proud of their country, they were humiliated. And also there was, if you know, for example, the 1920s in Weimar, and all the art and the music, there's all this new stuff, right? And so if you just have some conservatism in your system, you feel like you're living in a totally different world, right? You don't recognize the world you used to live in anymore because there's abstract art, right? There are urinals that are art. There are paintings that make no sense, right? There's music that you've never listened to before. Women have short hair and all kinds of things, right? And so I think what happened was that a lot of people felt like the world was out of whack. And they wanted to go back to something that they could recognize. So that's at least, those are some of the reasons. Yeah.
Well, you may wonder why the Germans accepted Hitler and Nazism. And so much of it had to do with what happened in World War I.
Right.
Because World War I, Germany did not initiate. They were allies with the Austrians and some other countries,
And so were the victorious countries. And what happened is that they were called into question, those allies, and that's really started World War One. It wasn't the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. That just was a little spark. It was already set up that that could happen very easily. And then Germany was then punished by the victorious allies. Not only did they lose their industrial area, Alsace-Lorraine, but they also had to pay reparations. And they had to deal with that. And then, of course, there was the Depression soon after that, inflation and all that. So it really put Germany in a really bad situation.
Yeah.
And so you had a quote unquote savior.
No, absolutely. And the reparations, I think, would have banned in the 1980s or so. I mean, those were enormous amounts. And of course, in the Versailles Treaty, Germans were blamed for for the war entirely. And so a lot of them felt like we're just sort of the whipping boy of Europe now. So those were deep sort of psychological wounds that a lot of people carried with them. And part of the Hitler program was, we're going to tear up the Versailles Treaty, right? Exactly, and a lot of people wanted that, right? So that was very attractive to a lot of Germans to say, we do not think this was just, and they wanted somebody who said, away with that, right? And it's also true, of course, that the Kaiser and all these military leaders did not sign the Versailles Treaty; they just left. Right? So then the newly elected democratic government got to sign the Versailles Treaty, and that was the albatross around the neck of the Weimar Republic from day one. They did not cause the war, but they had to sign the Versailles Treaty. So there were all kinds of things that sort of came together to make this a really weak democracy. I just want to point out one more thing in the Scheirer book, and then we want to go to Bonhoeffer to have something more uplifting. At the very bottom of 239, I'm just going to read two sentences here, which I think is actually pretty important. So Scheirer writes that it would be misleading to give the impression that the persecution of Protestants and Catholics by the Nazi state tore the German people asunder, or even greatly aroused the vast majority of them. It did not. The people who had so lightly given up their political and cultural and economic freedoms were not, except for a relatively few, going to die or even risk imprisonment to preserve freedom of worship. What really aroused the Germans in the 30s was the glittering success of Hitler in providing jobs, creating prosperity, restoring Germany's military might, and moving from one triumph to another in foreign policy. Not many Germans lost much sleep over the arrest of a few thousand pastors and priests, or over the quarreling of various Protestant sects. So it was a sideshow for most people. Right? My grandmas wanted to raise their kids. Right? You have kids in the 1930s. You're a young mom. You don't. At least my grandmoms did not think about whose side to be on or which tank to stand in front of and where to go with the sign and where to protest for Jews. They just tried to make sure that they had enough to eat. So not a heroic position, but the position of most Germans at the time. That's just survival.
I was hearing a lot of parallels as you were talking about the fears, of the changes that are taking place, abstract art, women wearing short hair, the steep humiliation of parallels today by a certain group in our country who feel there's too much change and we want it back the way it was.
We want the 50s back.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, I've heard a lot of people say that, in 2008 and following, that they didn't recognize their country anymore. And also this the statement by Oppenheimer really struck me about the anger in the population. So that's certainly something that seems pretty familiar. And so Bonhoeffer then is an interesting character because he does not go along with it at all. And so I want to sort of look at a man who was able to see through this pretty clearly. And so this is from a biography of Bonhoeffer. And so page 53, the what is the church page, if you have that. And so I'll give you a 2-minute, introduction to Bonhoeffer. He was born in 1906. Well-to-do family, very highly educated. Lost one brother in World War I, but grew up with a loving family and a very strong grounding in education. He decided to study theology in the early 1920s. Ended up, going all the way in his studies in theology, and had a really eye-opening experience when he went to Rome. And this is so in the 1920s. This is in the mid-1920s. And I would just like to read the 2 paragraphs beginning with "to think of the church." So somebody could read the "to think of the church," and somebody could read the next one, the Bad Bonhoeffer paragraph, because this is one of the ways in which Bonhoeffer could not be co-opted by any sort of Christian nationalism or any kind of nationalism. So I thought this was worthwhile looking at. So could somebody read the "to think of the church" paragraph on the
To think of the church as something universal would change everything and set in motion the entire course of Bonhoeffer's remaining life. Because if the church was something that actually existed, then it existed not just in Germany or Rome, but beyond both. This glimpse of the church as something beyond the Lutheran Protestant Church of Germany as a universal Christian community was a revelation and an invitation to further thinking, what is the church? It was the question he would attack in his doctoral dissertation, Sanctorum Communio, and in his postdoctoral work, Act and Being.
Yeah. So he has that experience in Rome, right, in the Catholic Church, actually, when he realizes the church is universal and not German. And then comes another interesting paragraph, if somebody could jump in for that.
But Bonhoeffer was no mere academic. For him, ideas and beliefs were nothing if they did not relate to the world of reality outside one's mind. Indeed, his thoughts on the nature of the church would lead him into the ecumenical movement in Europe, causing him to link hands with Christians outside Germany, and therefore to see instantly the lie at the heart of the so-called orders of creation theology, which linked the idea of the church with the German folk. This idea of the church defined by racial identity and blood, which the Nazis would violently push and so many Germans tragically embrace, was anathema to the idea of the universal church. So it was on this Palm Sunday in Rome that Bonhoeffer's course was set in motion.
Thank you. So that to me was an interesting point. Right? So that once you realize that Christianity isn't owned by your own particular country, then you can sort of see through the lie, at the heart of any movement that says that, we own Christianity. So he has that experience. I don't think he might not even be 20 yet. So as a really young man traveling to Rome, and he kept this ecumenical vision throughout his entire life. So some of his closest collaborators and friends were not, part of his version of Christianity. But, any version of Christianity, wherever you came from, for him was the church. And so when the German Christians, right, which were this group that really embraced sort of the marriage of nationalism and Christianity, he wasn't tempted, right? And I think this is part of what I think I want to do is I don't want to be sort of tempted by these kind of things. And so when I look at people like Bonhoeffer, I can see, universal truths, right, are much more helpful than sort of small national or parochial truths. So that's part of who he is. Somebody who believes deeply in the ecumenical vision of Christianity from a young age on. So that's one of the things that has him, safe. Then the other thing that's worthwhile for us to talk about is his time in the United States. So he goes to the United States in the early 1930s, and he sees something that he hadn't seen in Germany, which is sort of really tragic in a way. People being entirely disenfranchised, right? Black Americans. And for him, right, that didn't exist in Germany, right? Because there weren't blacks in Germany, but Jews or others in Germany had a million times more rights and representation than blacks in the United States. And so when he came to the United States and he saw the situation of Black Americans, he immediately sort of was drawn to that experience because he felt like, yeah, that's where the church needs to be. Right? He always felt like the church needs to be on the side of the people who are oppressed and who are suffering. And so that was a powerful experience for him. And that is also something that led him then in 1933 and following to immediately side with the Jews, because his understanding was the church needs to support people who are oppressed. So he knew this, of course, historically and all the rest of it, but he saw it firsthand in the United States, and it was easy for him to translate that into Germany a few years later.
He even worshipped in Harlem. I mean, he even chose an African American church to become a part of when he was here.
Where was that?
Oh, do you know the name of it?
So this is
The location.
something called the
Harlem.
Abyssinian something church.
No, Harlem, that's what I was interested.
Oh yeah, he was in New York City.
And
Yeah.
probably the Abyssinian.
Yes. And he brought back all these spirituals to Germany, which in Germany, of course, it was a bit of an oddity, but he came back and he loved the spirituals. And you can sort of imagine bringing that back to all these, stiff-collared Germans. But he really fell in love with that. He felt like that's sort of where the energy was, and where Christianity actually was alive, was in those churches, in that music. And he was very moved by that. And then he meets somebody, and this is on the page where you see the power of film on the right. It's the next page if you turn it. And right above the power of film is a short paragraph that I just want to point out. So as he is in New York, he said, I think it's called Union Theological Seminary, which he was less impressed with than with the black churches, but nevertheless, he made a lot of good friends there. And one friend he met was Pierre Lasserre, is a Frenchman, who was a really committed pacifist. And so the top of that page, the paragraph beginning with Bonhoeffer respected Lasserre, could somebody jump in there? And that was really one of the key insights for Bonhoeffer.
Bonhoeffer respected Lasserre as a theologian, but did not agree with his strongly pacifist views. But because Bonhoeffer respected his theology, and perhaps because both were Europeans, he was open to exploring what Lasserre had to say. Lasserre got Bonhoeffer thinking along lines that would lead him to become involved in the ecumenical movement. Quote, do we believe in the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, or do we believe in the eternal mission of France? One can't be a Christian and a nationalist at the same time, end quote.
Yeah, so I thought that was appropriate for our adult forum here. So that was another insight, right, that Bonhoeffer sort of learned. And he had seen it, of course, in the ecumenical, impulse that he got in Rome. But just to get this sort of from this Frenchman, right, this Frenchman and this German in New York, talking about, what it meant to be a Christian, is sort of one more powerful lesson that Bonhoeffer sort of took to heart and took with him to Germany. So that's an interesting aspect again, right? So the ecumenical notion, the anti sort of nationalist notions, those were things that too many other Germans lacked, obviously, right? And so I'm interested in sort of both. I mean, of course, there are lots of people, but sort of the ones who just went away and said, yeah, it went along and said it's not such a big deal. And then what allows people like Thomas Mann or Bonhoeffer or Brecht, right, who all came from very different perspectives, to say this is wrong, right? This is evil. I'm not participating. I'm either leaving the country and never come back, the way that Einstein and Thomas Mann did, or Bonhoeffer, who actually sort of did the harder thing, who went back in to Germany to work there. So his time in New York was over. He's back in Germany. And in 1933, there's a sort of a really interesting moment. This is the next page of the handout, 141. At the bottom right, you see sort of the quotation there. So what happens is that Bonhoeffer gives a radio address that is sort of planned prior to Hitler taking over. But in this radio address, he attacks the Germans call it the Führerprinzip, right? The principle that the leader is always right. So obviously, a lot of the Nazi movement is a movement with a charismatic leader at the top, whose word is law, right? I mean, just like any absolute monarch in the Middle Ages, the Nazi, doctrine is that the leader controls everything. And so before the leader really becomes a leader, Bonhoeffer is already articulating his critique of that leader principle, because obviously, if you're a Christian, that makes no sense, right? That there is this human being whose word needs to be obeyed über alles, right? Above everything else. And so again, his Christianity makes him immune to following a human who sets himself up as the absolute authority. And so he gives this talk, and it's a pretty long talk. We don't have time for the whole thing, but he talks about how a true leader, right? You see this right above the quotation. True leader must know the limitations of his authority, right? So a good leader is somebody who knows, where his or her limitations are. And of course, for the Nazis, there are no limitations to the power of the Führer. And so if you turn the page, we can read those two paragraphs, beginning with only when a man. So somebody could read that first paragraph, and somebody else read the second paragraph. This is Bonhoeffer talking about what it means to be a good leader, and it's a juxtaposition to the Nazi cult of, Hitler.
Where is it?
Only when a man sees that office?
Yes, please. Yes, we're on the. It should be 142, and then it's the page after the power of film. So if you turn that over, sorry, it's
It has a little 140, just like 145 at the top.
yeah. So the page begins with a good leader at the top left. Okay, jump in, please. Yep.
Only when a man sees that office is an ultimate authority in the face of an ultimate indescribable authority in the face of the authority of God, has the real situation been reached. And before this authority, the individual knows himself to be completely alone. The individual is responsible before God. And this solitude of man's position before God, this subjection to an ultimate authority, is destroyed when the authority of the leader or of the office is seen as ultimate authority. Alone before God, man becomes what he is, free and committed in responsibility at the same time. Somebody else?
Yeah, can someone read the second paragraph too?
The fearful danger of the present time is that above the cry for authority, be it of a leader or of an office, we forget that man stands alone before the ultimate authority, and that anyone who lays violent hands on man here is infringing eternal laws and taking upon himself superhuman authority, which will eventually crush him. The eternal law that the individual stands alone before God takes fearful vengeance where it is attacked and distorted. Thus, the leader points to the office, but leader and office together point to the final authority itself, before which Reich or state are penultimate authorities. Leaders are offices which set themselves up as gods, mock God, and the individual who stands alone before him must perish.
Right? So for Bonhoeffer, that any human authority that sets itself up as the ultimate authority is a mockery of God, the way that he sees it. And therefore, he could never go along with this cult of a leader. So the ecumenicalism, the non-nationalism, and the objection to the leader principle, the cult of the leader, were all things that Bonhoeffer had before Hitler even takes over. Right? So if you read this, the next sentence, this speech is given 48 hours after Hitler takes power, right? And it was prepared before, right? So he had already, because obviously the Nazis had been talking about this, leader principle, and so Bonhoeffer, before Hitler even takes power, is already in opposition to the principle of a leader who is the ultimate authority. Obviously, he's in opposition to the German Christians, right? The Christian nationalists in Germany, and he is very much in favor of the ecumenical Christian community. So that then brings up the question, and that's the last thing we have time for, is what the church should do. And that is, if you turn the page, there's a small 153 at the top, and it says there's no power but of God at the top of the page. So these are some comments that he made sort of about the Jewish question, right, which then becomes the thing in German, right, the Jewish question. And the question for the church is, what do we do about the Jews, right? And as we learned earlier, most Protestants said, we do nothing about the Jews because our leader Luther and our leader Hitler are entirely in line when it comes to what we should do about the Jews, right? So most Protestants have no problem with anti-Jewish legislation, deportation, and what have you. Bonhoeffer, of course, did have a major objection to that. And so he tries to articulate that. And that's really interesting. So he talks about what the role of the church is. And so there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs that I think are worthwhile looking at. And he talks about the 3 ways in which what the church's role vis-a-vis the state is, right? And he's not talking about 2024 United States, right? He's talking about a situation when you are in a country where the state has gone mad, right? Where you are living in a situation where there's no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, no freedom of anything. But it is pretty interesting. So if somebody could start with "Then he moved," and let's just read 5 full paragraphs, and then that's all the reading we can do for today.
Then he moved on to clarify that the church does nonetheless play a vital role for the state. What is that role? The church must continually ask the state whether its action can be justified as legitimate action of the state. In other words, as action which leads to law and order, and not to lawlessness and disorder. In other words, it is the church's role to help the state be the state. If the state is not creating an atmosphere of law and order, as Scripture says it must, then it is the job of the church to draw the state's attention to this failing. And if, on the other hand, the state is creating an atmosphere of excessive law and order,
It is the church's job to draw the state's attention to that too.
If the state is creating excessive law and order, then the state develops its power to such an extent that it deprives Christian preaching and Christian faith of their rights. Bonhoeffer called this a grotesque situation. The church, he said, must reject this encroachment of the order of the state precisely because of its better knowledge of the state and of the limitations of its action. The state which endangers the Christian proclamation negates itself.
Bonhoeffer then famously enumerated the three possible ways in which the church can act toward the state. The first, already mentioned, was for the church to question the state regarding its actions and their legitimacy, to help the state be a state as God has ordained. The second way, and here he took it boldly, was to aid the victims of state action. He said that the church has an unconditional obligation to the victims of any ordering society. And before that sentence is over, he took another leap, far bolder than the first. In fact, some ministers walked out by declaring that the church has an unconditional obligation to the victims of any ordering of society, even if they do not belong to the Christian community. Everyone knew that Bonhoeffer was talking about the Jews, including the Jews who were not baptized Christians. Bonhoeffer then quoted Galatians, "Do good to all men." To say that it is unequivocally the responsibility of the Christian church to help all Jews was dramatic, even revolutionary. But Bonhoeffer wasn't through yet.
The third way the church can act toward the state, he said, is not to just bandage the victims under the wheel, but to put a spoke in the wheel itself. The translation is awkward, but he meant that a stick must be jammed into the spokes of the wheel to stop the vehicle. It is sometimes not enough to help those crushed by the evil actions of a state, but at some point, the church must directly take action against the state to stop it from perpetrating evil. This, he said, is permitted only when the church sees its very existence threatened by the state. And when the state ceases to be the state as defined by God, Bonhoeffer added that this condition exists if the state forces exclusion of baptized Jews from our Christian congregations or in prohibition of our mission to the Jews.
All right, thank you. So those are actually pretty famous comments that Bonhoeffer makes about what the church has to do. And again, these are very extreme situations, right? So if the state guarantees your freedom of expression and all the rest of it, then hallelujah. And you don't have to act against the state. But this is after the so-called Aryan paragraph was passed, when people who had, one grandparent that was Jewish or what have you, were not allowed to be civil servants. And pastors in Germany are civil servants, they're paid by the state. And so to him, that crossed the line, right? So now the state is doing something that doesn't let the church be the church, and the state is doing something that is actually not the job of the state. And in that situation, you have to, jam the wheel. And that leads him then ultimately to do something that's not very Christian, which is to, participate in the assassination, of the leader, which was a difficult thing for him to come to terms with. But the situation had gotten that extreme, of course, that he felt like that was the only way to act. But so obviously we could talk about this for hours, but these are just a few things I wanted to sort of throw out to give us a bit of an understanding of the situation in Germany in the 1930s, and how at least some people like Bonhoeffer had the not just the background, right? There were other people who objected, but who had sort of the grounding in a theology and an understanding of what it means to be a religious person that didn't even, he was untemptable, right, by the Nazis, right? A lot of Germans felt like, now we're successful again, the economy is booming, and okay, there are a few things I don't quite approve of, but oh well. And he didn't do that. And of course, I find that admirable. And so I just wanted to point out a few things about Bonhoeffer that I feel like I can learn from in terms of, what are sort of non-negotiables, right, of one's faith, of one's convictions.
I wonder if we could end with a poem because it's such a beautiful expression of this theology.
You wonder if we could?
Yeah.
All right, so Elaine, so here's a poem that is also very well known. And he writes this in prison in 1945, right? So you probably all know that he is part of that, assassination attempt on the 20th of July in 1944. He sort of helps out with Stauffenberg and a lot of these, landed von so-and-so and von so-and-so, right, who didn't leave, but who were objecting to it. And so this is a poem that he wrote. I'll just read it in German. You can read along in the English. Von guten Mächten treu und still umgeben, behütet und getröstet wunderbar, so will ich diese Tage mit euch leben und mit euch gehen in ein neues Jahr. Noch will das Alte unsere Herzen quälen, noch drückt uns böser Tage schwere Last. Ach Herr, gib unseren aufgeschreckten Seelen das Heil, für das du uns geschaffen hast. Und reichst du uns den schweren Kelch, den bittern, des Leids, gefüllt bis an den höchsten Rand, so nehmen wir ihn dankbar ohne Zittern aus deiner guten und geliebten Hand. Doch willst du uns noch einmal Freude schenken an dieser Welt und ihrer Sonne Glanz, dann wollen wir das Vergangenen gedenken und dann gehören dir unser Leben ganz. Lass warm und hell die Kerzen heute flammen, die du in unsere Dunkelheit gebracht, für, wenn es sein kann, wieder uns zusammen. Wir wissen es, dein Licht scheint in der Nacht. Wenn sich die Stille nun tief um uns bereitet, so lass uns hören jenen vollen Klang der Welt, die unsichtbar sich um uns weitet, all deiner Kinder hohen Lobgesang. Von guten Mächten wunderbar geborgen, erwarten wir getrost, was kommen mag. Gott ist bei uns am Abend und am Morgen und ganz gewiss an jedem neuen Tag. My students would say bars. You heard that expression? It's sort of when you drop the mic and
Yeah.
Okay, that's right. So in some sense, we did no justice to this big issue, obviously, and no justice to Bonhoeffer, but it's sort of a taste, I hope.
I think you hit very good points, the key things.
Yeah, I think that what it does is really give us an awareness of some very clear parallels that we can draw on. And the three things that you were talking about, that were Bonhoeffer's ideas, to be ecumenical, to support all people, to not allow the church to be subjugated to the state, but to call the state on its oppression. And I think those things are really clear and we can make use of them. So thank you so much for sharing where they were in Bonhoeffer's work and leading us there.
I like what you said, it acts as an inoculation.
Yeah.
To be co-opted ourselves.
I think the word power comes to my mind. When you're thinking of Nazism and what was happening in all of those years leading up to Bonhoeffer's revelation of so many things, and how that relates today. And the bottom word so much to be is power. Who is choosing? What is choosing to be in power? There's unbelievable parallels. And very frightening parallels.
The one parallel that I am really humbled by, and it just came to mind, is who is a national in our country today? We are a nation of immigrants. So I'm from Swedish and Scottish heritage, you're from German heritage. So who is a national here? We had Ellis Island that welcomed everybody. So the nationals are who's the Native American here?
I think everybody who lives in this country, as citizens or maybe beyond, are the nationals.
But that's my little point. I came here from, my heritage is from another country, as whether it's Sweden or Nigeria or Guatemala. What is the difference between my inheriting this country as a Guatemalan inheriting this country and claiming it as my nation?
You know, everybody's putting down so many migrants now. It's just hard to believe, hard to imagine.
Well, I think if you become a citizen, and I said it and beyond, but mainly you can focus on, you know, the citizen, whether you're natural, you know, native, or you come.
We got rid of the natives.
I'm not talking about the natives. Everybody here right now.
I think this really forces us to go to a higher level. And the higher level has nothing to do with where you came from. Yes, we all have traditions, and it's hard to forget those completely. And yet, if we are to go forward and we are to have populations succeed us in time, we have to go to a higher level, which is going to God and taking a look and seeing what principles we want to live by. And I would venture to say it's not just the Episcopal ones, but as a whole, the Church Universal, and what God is telling all of us we should be thinking about.
The whole thing for me, the part of, you know, what I got out of this, but the big part of it, is you go where Bonhoeffer was, go where he went. And so I'm thinking of the parallels of that old boy. You know, why is it that we want to know about the rise and the fall of the Third Reich? What is the parallel? What are we looking for? What is the message?
Ultimate failure. Well, we need to look at our leaders and see what's the parallel in our leaders.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of parallels.
Thank you. The next Sunday, we're going to talk about what our response is. And as I mentioned, we're going to begin with some teaching from Valerie Kaur, who is an activist, who gives some really practical strategies. And then we're going to talk about what is our response. So I hope you all will return for the final session. And thank you so much for giving us this insight into Bonhoeffer and his work.
Thank you.